All right, so now we're back. We've moved material through the small intestine, through peristalsis, just like we moved it through the esophagus. And the early part of the small intestine, a lot more digestion. The last part of the small intestine, a lot more absorption. But there's absorption and digestion occurring throughout. Now, where the small intestine, that would be the last part, the ileum, connects to the large intestine. Okay, so here, this is the ileum portion of the small intestine, and here, this portion, I should say here, is the large intestine, and then we have a few parts here. This part here, that's kind of below the intersection as I've drawn it, this is cecum, and in us, there's a shriveled up piece off of the cecum called the appendix. Okay? There's also a valve in here called the Ileocecal Valve, right, that connects the small intestine and the large intestine. Okay? All right, relative to other animals, specifically the herbivores, we have a relatively small cecum. The herbivores tend to have much larger ceca, and that relates to what they do. I remember when I was your age, I had comparative vertebrate anatomy. A lot of you take human gross anatomy, that's just humans. Comparative vertebrate anatomy does anatomy of all the vertebrates. But in a rabbit that we dissected, the cecum, when you put it out on the table, was about this long. Very, very long cecum. This cecum holds a lot of bacteria, and the bacteria are bacteria that can do a lot of this plant digestion. So in the case of a rabbit, it's loaded with bacteria that are capable of doing cellulose digestion, hemicellulose digestion, etc. So imagine this kind of long extension off full of bacteria, and as material moves into the large intestine, some of that bacteria gets pulled with it. The bacteria continue to kind of grow and mature in here and be doled out to assist with digestion. Our cecum is much smaller. Papers more recently have argued that the cecum's role is that it houses a lot of bacteria that are important to us, including E. coli and thousands of others, but no plant digesting bacteria like rabbits have. And that if you had a nasty bout with diarrhea, and I'm thinking of some serious ones like diarrhea associated with cholera, dysentery, or typhoid, right? You'd clear out the microbiota in your gut, and then the cecum would have housed in there bacteria that could recolonize the gut after a bad episode of diarrhea. Okay, so people still kind of think the cecum has a role in humans. At the end of it, there's a finger-like projection called the appendix. When I was your age, it was thought to be vestigial. Vestigial means it was important to our ancestors, but not so important to us anymore. They subsequently found out that early in development, the appendix does have an immune system role. Its immune system role is in B cell production and also a reservoir for healthy bacteria. Later in life, there have been more and more papers, might be interesting to do a reaction paper on that, that talk about kind of what they think the appendix might do, but all those kind of hypotheses haven't made their way into the textbooks yet, so we won't really talk about them. Okay? All right. Okay. Now, the large intestine, as it's organized, you have the ileum coming into the cecum portion, and then we have a part of the large intestine that ascends, moves across, and descends. So we typically talk about the large intestine being broken into an ascending portion, a transverse portion, and a descending portion. Right, so this is called the ascending colon. This is the transverse colon and the descending colon. And when you'd have a colonoscopy, right, like a scope in your colon, that's what they're doing, is looking at the ascending, transverse, and descending portions. Just as an aside, a little bit of humor, I went to high school in Colon, Michigan. Its claim to fame is that it's the magic capital of the world. About 80% of the magic tricks sold worldwide are produced in Colon, even though it's a town of about 2,000 people. But I was on the track team, and we had like sweatpants we would wear around that said Colon track on it, and I never really got the joke until I was much older. All right, so ascending, transverse, and descending colon. Okay, now a big function of the colon is to recoup water that was invested in the digestion process. Right, so why might water be invested heavily in the digestion process? Well, if you have to do hydrolysis, you have to have water, right? So you invest heavily in water, and you lose that water to the hydroxyl bonds, right, on each of those two monomers. But your body invests more water into the digestion process than will be used in hydrolysis. That way water's not limiting to the process. Well, that means by the time you get to the colon, digestion and absorption have finished. We've finished doing what we're going to do with this material. There should be a lot of water coming into the large intestine, and one of the jobs would be to take this water back up. Okay? Right? And the idea is about 90% of that invested water is recouped in the large intestine. It's very important the large intestine be able to recoup this water, otherwise we'd be in big trouble. Okay? Now, much of the water is recouped because what the what the colon is doing is it's pulling materials from the lumen, right, into the tissue. Right? We'll talk about exactly what here in a second, but we're not talking about the monomers. Those are absorbed in the small intestine. What we're talking about here are ions, things like potassium, sodium, chlorine, etc., chloride. And as those are pulled into the tissues, the water should come along through osmosis. We will also talk about this theme quite a bit, and it will continue throughout your lives as biology types, is that cells don't move water around. The way they move water around is to move ions. You move ions, water will come with it. So if you want to get water to go somewhere, move the ions and water will follow. So this is the trick being used in the large intestine to make sure that the water is moved out of the large intestine lumen. Now, once we're in the colon, it's not chyme anymore, it's feces. So the material found in the large intestine is feces. This water balancing act that the colon performs, if it doesn't pull enough water out, right, you'd have what we would call diarrhea, and if it pulled too much water out, you'd have what we would call constipation. Bacteria can affect this, the wrong kind of bacteria in the large intestine, not the right kind, but the wrong kind, can cause some of these problems by irritating the lining of the colon and not allowing it to do its function. So the causal organism in cholera works this way. It irritates the heck out of the large intestinal lining, and that means water is not absorbed properly, which means you end up with the diarrhea because the water is left over. Okay? All right. In the large intestine, there's a large resident flora of bacteria. Perfectly natural for these to be here. Thousands and thousands of different species, last I heard. And these bacteria are able to feed on the undigested material coming from the small intestine. We do a good job with digestion, but there's a lot of stuff left over because we can't do all of the absorption. There are also materials that we can't fully digest. Those materials end up in the colon. That's what's keeping all these bacteria alive and allowing them to do well. This is like the perfect environment for a lot of them. It's warm in here, right? 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. There's lots of water. They need water to survive, and they're protected from their predators inside here in this environment. So they do very well in the large intestine, and as a consequence of them being there, they help keep the nasty guys away, right? By having a resident flora, you keep away bad bacteria like Clostridium difficile, right? If somebody gets a lot of antibiotic over a long period of time and you clear out all this bacteria, sometimes nasties can move in and then they're very hard to displace. But as long as the resident flora is here, you're protected from these nasty bacteria because as they move through the digestive system, there's no place for them to be, right? All the other bacteria are occupying the space. These bacteria produce waste products. The waste products include folic acid, biotin, vitamin K, and a lot of the B vitamins. These are all vitamins that are required in our diet. So we do gain something from them being there other than just them taking up space. They do produce metabolically some material that we need. Okay? Now, that means that this feces as a material is a bunch of undigested stuff, including stuff that we don't have enzymes to digest anyway. Collectively, all of this stuff is called fiber. Fiber is just undigested material. The fibers tend to be fibery, like cellulose is a long linear chain of beta-glucose. Chitin is a long linear chain of N-acetylglucosamine. So they're long molecular fibers. That's where it first got its name. But imagine this fiber plus other undigested material plus bacteria all together. That's what the feces is. Bacteria, fiber, and other undigested material. Okay? All right, the terminal portion of the colon here, so they've got it drawn down here. This is the rectum. The rectum is basically a storage bin, and then from the rectum to the opening, which is called the anus, right, there are two sphincters. The first sphincter is an involuntary sphincter. The second sphincter is a voluntary sphincter. This is a common trick too in organisms. Let the brain, without you thinking about it, run this first sphincter. And it keeps this first one closed, and as material builds up in here, it begins to put pressure on the sphincter. Then what the brain does is communicate the fact that there's pressure on this first sphincter to your conscious brain. Hey, things are getting full down here in the rectum. And then what you do in response to this signal is tighten up this sphincter as the involuntary system lets go of the first one. Okay? That way, you have time to go find a bathroom before you actually release the material that's in the rectum. Okay? Just a little aside here, you have this nice little system, but it takes a little while to figure out how it runs. So you can imagine young children when they're first learning how to be potty trained, there's always that kind of look on their face of like, right? And that look is the involuntary sphincter just let go, and the voluntary sphincter, the one on the outside here, wasn't ready to assume control of things, and you've just gone to the bathroom in your pants. Is that okay? All right, so the opening here is the anus. That's where feces is moved to the outside world. Okay? All right, now in some organisms, like birds and reptiles, I mentioned before that there's a cloaca instead of a rectum. The distinction is that we have a separate urogenital system and digestive system. The birds and reptiles, it's all together, which means the urogenital system dumps into the cloaca just like the digestive system does. Okay, so that's really the only distinction. And then one more thing to mention to you. With the rabbits, they have this large cecum with the bacteria that digest cellulose. So I digest all the cellulose here in the large intestine, but because the absorption is done by the small intestine, we have all this glucose, beta glucose, that could be usable, but I can't get it into the body. So rabbits will go to the bathroom, they release their feces as these little pellets, and then rabbits tend to go to the bathroom in the same place they eat, because they will then eat these little pellets, and then they can complete the digestion of this material in the small intestine and absorb the material back out of it. This is called rectification, and it's done by rabbits, right? Another trick, a little different from the ruminants, but still dealing with the same problem, which is the inability to digest plant material easily, having to call on bacteria to help you do that. Okay?